That's okay. I'm going to a little bit about what can you do to keep waters clean around here for you and for people downstream. So just briefly about me, the intro said a lot of this. So I'll just say that, I've worked in water conservation now for 10 years. I've lived in Taos all of that time. I grew up in upstate New York. And then I went into Missouri for a few years to do my master's degree, and I studied bats, and I still catch bats in the summer for a few weeks for consulting firms. It's fun, and I like to keep my permits and keep that part of my past going. I also teach a couple classes at UNM Taos, and I volunteer for the Sierra Club in our area of New Mexico in the northern group. So it sounds like if you were at earlier presentations, you may have heard a little bit about the Sierra Club, but I'll just go briefly. It's the oldest conservation organization in the country. Since they're 131 years old. And their mission is to protect wildlife and wild places. There's over 10,000 members in the New Mexico and Texas area of the Sierra Club. The Rio Grande chapter includes El Paso and all of New Mexico. And our focuses are in conservation, public lands, wildlife, and energy. So things like promoting clean energy, solar, electric vehicles is a large part of this chapter of the Sierra Club's work. So just a brief update, the New Mexico had their legislative session in January, and it just ended this week on, I think it was Monday or maybe Friday. And they passed a really exciting bill that bans the disposal of high-level nuclear waste in southern New Mexico. There was a big push to put a lot of the country's nuclear waste at a site in southern New Mexico. And states such as Texas and North Dakota already have laws against this. So New Mexico just passed that, which I would say is good news for El Paso. We won't have that nuclear waste just upstream. And they passed 3 different climate-related bills that they're excited about. One of them helps people purchase electric vehicles. Another helps requires or allows for tax credits for energy storage in your house. And then another one promotes energy storage in large facilities, like storage facilities for renewable energy. So as I mentioned, the Rio Grande chapter includes El Paso. It used to include all of Texas, and then the Lone Star chapter was formed. So if you move to different parts of Texas, you may be in that other chapter. And then the Rio Grande chapter includes these other groups. The northern group is where I am, up in Taos. We've got a Los Alamos group, a central group around Albuquerque. The southern group covers southern New Mexico, and then we've got this group in El Paso. So a brief El Paso group update. There is a Chihuahuan Desert Conference that will be in November, and they're actually open for abstracts right now. So if you have any research or anything that you'd like to present at the conference, they're looking for that right now, and registration is open. And then the Otero Mesa Action Team is looking for more support from the community. So if you're interested in that area and working around conserving it, you can contact the information there on the screen. And Jerry is in our audience, so if you'd like to talk to him about the Otero Mesa, want to raise your hand, Jerry? All right, thanks. Up in the northern group, I'm not going to go into an update on all the groups, just El Paso and then where I'll be speaking about. The northern group, we work on things like monitoring the Taos Ski Valley. A billionaire bought the ski valley several years ago, and it's on the Rio Hondo, and they have a wastewater treatment plant that puts water from the ski valley use right into the river. And they've just been going crazy with additions and buildings, and there's new hotels, and there's a lot more people up there now, and they have a huge gondola update. They're going to try to add a new gondola and add a new restaurant and all sorts of things. So we're keeping an eye on that and commenting around our environmental concerns with adding infrastructure to 10,000 feet on the mountain there. And then we're also looking into a green hydrogen project and whether I think we will support that up in Cuesta. There's a mine that has wastewater coming out of it, and there's an idea to actually use the mine wastewater and then solar energy together to make really clean energy. So you can split those water molecules and make hydrogen using all green energy. So you can use wastewater that would otherwise need to be cleaned, and you can use solar energy that we have going up in that area to create energy. So we're pretty excited about that project. And then there's also a lot of work in the Santa Fe area around providing tax credits and low-income loans to folks to put solar on their homes. So we do a lot of work with that. Okay, any questions? You know, we're a small group, so feel free to raise your hand or just chime in with a question while I'm talking today. I meant to say that earlier. And I'll also try to just make sure that I'm pausing for questions. So any questions so far just on Sierra Club activities or getting started? Yes. Oh, yeah.
I'll just also add that we had a big victory recently on the Biden administration declaring the Kastner Range a national monument, and the Sierra Club was part of a coalition that worked on that major victory.
Oh, wow. That's exciting. Great. Thank you. Okay, so let's get to know our watershed a little bit. Just very briefly, you know, a watershed is a drainage basin, and you can speak of them in varying sizes. So you can talk about the larger Rio Grande watershed, which we'll look at for a moment. But then, you know, so you could live within the larger Rio Grande watershed, but you might live right next to, you know, I don't know the rivers around here, so I'll use an example, the Rio Pueblo. You know, so you would be in the greater Rio Grande watershed, but your house might be next to the Rio Pueblo. So that's your smaller watershed where the water is draining into that tributary before it goes down into the larger river. So just keep that in mind as we talk about watersheds, but they're going to be defined by some sort of divide. There's going to be slopes and topography that causes the water to go to a certain area. So you might be in the base of that Rio Pueblo, so all the water around you is draining into that river, and then that's going into the Rio Grande watershed. But there's larger mountains around the Rio Grande that are also making that a watershed. So I hope that makes sense. Just a quick look at Texas watersheds, river basins. You can see we're in the Rio Grande River Basin in El Paso, and then you've got some larger ones. Those black lines are dividing the river basins there. And this is that Rio Grande watershed I mentioned. You can see it starts in southern Colorado, way up, you know, about 100 miles north of the border. The area we'll be speaking about today is just north of that Espanola dot, below the Colorado border. And it's about 60 miles or so, the area we'll be talking of south of the Colorado border. And then you can see where El Paso is on the map, kind of right sort of in the middle of the larger Rio Grande watershed, maybe a little bit north of the middle. And then if you go to the east, you would be in the Pecos watershed. This is a view from one of our photographers looking north. This is the Rio Grande Gorge, just south of Taos, looking north towards Cuesta. This is a shot I've taken of the river. You know, it looks pretty small in the gorge here. You can barely see the water, but it's down there in the rocks in the middle there. Let's see, I've got a pointer, so it's right here. It doesn't look really big, very big. This is a summer photo, but it does get a bit larger, you know, in the spring with the runoff. Another shot of the river in a knot in the gorge. And this is one of the headwater wetlands that we work to restore to help with water flow and water quality in the Rio Grande. So this is the Midnight Meadows wetland. It is north of Cuesta. It's near Chevron Molycorp mine that I'll probably mention more later. So this drains into the Red River, which drains into the Rio Grande. These are some volunteers going down to working to repair fences to keep cattle out and to put structures in the wetland that actually help to restore flow to the wetland and restore that connection you want in wetlands from the surface water to the groundwater. Okay, now that we are oriented to place a little bit and where we'll be talking about today, let's talk more about water sampling. The Water Sentinels are our national team. It was a national push by the Sierra Club to have citizen science teams around the country collecting water quality data. The program has since been less, it's not happening as much around the nation, but there are still a few teams. And the team I'll be talking about, the Rios de Taos Water Sentinels, is a joint effort now between the Sierra Club and Amigos Bravos to monitor waterways in and around Taos. So Amigos Bravos is a nonprofit where I've worked for 10 years. Our mission is to protect and restore the waters of New Mexico. So we're statewide, and that's a pretty large undertaking to protect and restore all the waters of the whole state. So the way that we do that is we focus on 3 program areas. We work to hold polluters accountable. That's sort of our policy arm, where we will work to make sure mines are following their regulations. That's a lot of our work. The Los Alamos National Laboratory is a big part of what we monitor in the state, and whether they're following their regulations and cleaning up the lab according to the rules and that they are supposed to, and the deadlines they have for cleanup. And then we restore watershed health. That's like the wetland I just showed, working with volunteers to restore that wetland. We have a Wetland Jewels program that focuses on all the different wetlands in northern New Mexico and works to restore them. And then our Building a Rivers movement is things like this presentation. We go into schools, we do field trips, we give trainings, anything the community asks of us, that we can do. We can go in and talk about our river otter reintroduction program, or we can teach kids how to sample water using water quality meters that the volunteers in the program I'll talk about today do. So we do a lot of education. We can give Clean Water Act trainings and talk to college students or to adult groups who are worried about something in their waterways, and teach them how they can use federal legislation to enact change. If you want to learn more, I know we're New Mexico based, and I know that we're in Texas, but those waters are upstream of you. They do affect what comes down, and the cleaner our waters are above us, the cleaner the water is when it gets here. So, and we have a free newsletter if you just want to get emails and know what's going on. Yes. Who's the otter? That's a river otter. So Amigos Bravos worked in 2008 through 2010 to reintroduce river otters to the Rio Grande. So they had been hunted to extinction in most of the country due to the fur trapping times. And about 25 states now have reintroduced them successfully. And New Mexico was one of the last ones to do it. And we now have, they think, around 200 river otters romping in the Rio Grande up and around Taos. They go as south as Cochiti Dam, sort of north of Albuquerque. And every once in a while, we'll get a sighting in Albuquerque, but it usually turns out to be a muskrat. So they haven't made it too far down yet, but they're doing really well. They can be 50 pounds. The males, yeah, they can be pretty large, and then they have a big long tail, so they can be like 4 feet long or so, 4 or 5 feet long with their tail. They eat fish, And, we have a river otter monitoring program. So I have some pictures thrown in here. So we just have trail cameras up in places that we know they're living and we catch them, just doing their thing. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I bet you don't have many fish down here in the Rio Grande. No. Right. No, we have a fish hatchery on the Red River and they like to live there, as you can imagine. They just free fish all the time getting put into the hatchery. But yeah, we do. We have a fair amount of fish and a healthy population of river otters. The Game and Fish Department just reintroduced a few fresh ones because the genetic diversity wasn't really great because the population's small and all the reintroduced otters came from the same place. So they just got about 10 new ones from Louisiana instead of from Oregon. And so hopefully they're all mixing well. And yeah, that's what the genetic study estimated a few years ago. I think there's around that many. We introduced 33 originally, and then there was about 10 new ones reintroduced just 2 years ago or so.
Is there any opposition to that, like the news?
Yes, there was some, and every once in a while there's issues with them, getting into the fish hatchery. People get upset or concerned that the, one year there wasn't a good hatch of trout eggs in that area of the hatchery, and people really thought it was the river otters. But from what we could tell, it was more of an environmental thing that year with heat and temperature and rainfall and when the runoff occurred and all sorts of things, really more than the otters. There hasn't been a lot of problems since, but Amigos Bravos does make it part of our mission to sort of work with the community around that and why river otters will actually help the rivers because crayfish are not native to the river up there. So they're eating all the crayfish and getting them out. And then they go after the slowest fish first, because that's easiest. And then, they might go after trout at somewhere like a hatchery. But really, they're reinstating that balance of fish that should be there by getting rid of the slow ones and the invasive crayfish. And in the long run, it really will be good. But sometimes fishermen do get a little upset when they see an otter eating a fish and they're not catching any. But in the long run, I really do believe they were here. They're a keystone species. They're really going to put that ecosystem back in the balance that it should have. So it's a great question. I didn't even think to talk about otters. Okay, so why water quality monitoring? Why do we want to do this? Why does it matter? Our state only monitors our surface waterways once every 9 to 10 years. So they have several locations they monitor, hundreds, but they can only do each river once every 9 to 10 years. So they're really only getting a once in a decade snapshot of how healthy our rivers are. And I did try to dig in a little bit to how often Texas does it, but it's not something they just put out there, in their documents or on their website. You kind of have to know someone who works there. So we know because we work with our environment department. Does anyone here know how often Texas does it?
For the Rio Grande in our area, the IBWC has a monitoring program that they do quarterly monitoring in our, yeah.
Every year.
Well, because it's only the Rio Grande. We don't have a lot of rivers in our area.
Okay. That's great. Thank you. That's good news. So you're getting more frequent data than we are, even if it's not of a large area, it sounds like. So another reason that we want to sample the Rio Grande is that surface waters in New Mexico are impaired. And we'll learn a little bit more about what that means later on. But basically only 22% of our streams are meeting the water quality standards, so are as clean as state and federal regulations say they should be. And then for their designated uses, and I'll get into what some of these words mean in a minute. And then only 43% of our, not only, but 43% of our streams are impaired for at least one of the ways that the stream is used, a designated use. So other reasons is that you can enact change with citizen science data. A quick example, the Rio Fernando de Taos that runs through the heart of Taos was listed for E. coli based on our annual data. So the environment department wasn't seeing an E. coli problem because they were only sampling once a decade, but we were sampling 3 times a year, every year. And we could say, hey, this river is having E. coli all the time, every year, every time we sample. And now the river is, we've got a coalition of the community, a collaborative that's formed. We just got a $200,000 grant for the river to work on cleaning up E. coli and to work with the community to see what sort of restoration and what they would like the river to look like. So it's just a really great example because the Rio Fernando, this runs through 2 grazing allotments here and picks up a lot of E. coli that way. And then it runs through the heart of Taos in that really bright red section right here. This section is that large grant I just mentioned. We're going to really be focusing on all the inputs from the community here, what we can do about it, how the community would like to see the river restored, because it dries up here. It's all diverted for agriculture right about here at the base of the canyon, and it comes into these fields. But then the river itself is completely dry for most of the summer, and all that's really getting in there is pet waste and leaky septic tanks. And it's just, people don't use the river, they can't access it, and it's really a shame. And so we're really excited that we might be able to see this river become revitalized and part of something the town loves. And that all started with citizen science monitoring. So a couple other reasons why. Another example is we were able to get the Taos wastewater treatment plant upgraded using our data. We were able to show that there were nutrients, so nitrogen and phosphates going into the river the wastewater treatment plant effluent goes right into the Rio Pueblo. And we were able to sample right below the treatment plant and show, hey, like they are not meeting standards. They're putting too many nutrients into the river. And then the wastewater treatment plant was able to garner state funds and get upgrades done to decrease those nutrients. And then one other reason is you can use the data for things like designations called outstanding natural resource waters. Has anyone heard of those? It's not something you hear about a lot. Has anyone heard about wild and scenic rivers? Yes, so it's a similar idea, but it's actually a stronger designation. So it actually means once you're an outstanding natural resource water, no one can pollute that river to make the water quality levels degrade. So whatever you had found, they had we showed that certain rivers were this clean on all these parameters. You can't degrade, so nothing can be built on the river that's going to degrade the health of the river. So just last year, we were able to get the Upper Rio Grande and the Rio Hondo, 125 miles total, protected under those outstanding natural resource waters. And that was using some of our citizen science data. And then citizens in the Pecos, the Upper Pecos, also went and they testified at these hearings and said, we think that the Pecos should also be designated this way, and really spoke for their river. And there was a lot of designations, and we were really excited about these victories. It means those rivers will have to stay as clean as they are right now forever. Just some pictures used in the campaign of those outstanding natural resource waters. These are the Pecos and the wetlands around the Pecos. Okay, so now that we know why we're motivated and excited to do citizen science monitoring, how do you monitor rivers every year? We're going to go into just briefly each of these steps and how you create a citizen science team. So you want to join forces, and then you want to create a volunteer team. You want to decide what rivers to sample. What parameters do you need to sample? What data do you need to collect? And then how do you need to represent your data? Are you going to submit it to the environment department? Are you going to share it with the community? You might want to show those results in different ways. Your environment department might need you to submit the results in a certain way. Ours does. We have to do a certain Excel sheet and a certain details that they need. But the community, you might want to show simple graphs or have just a simple radio ad about what you found, or an article in the paper. There would be different ways that you would share results based on what your goals are. So to join forces, and to get community involvement, you want to reach out to volunteers and you want to have either the Sierra Club or another organization involved. So Amigos Bravos and the Sierra Club work really well together because Amigos Bravos is able to bring in some outside grants so we can fund our citizen science program. We can pay for labs to look at our results. And then the Sierra Club also has a grant program that likes to fund the Sentinels groups that are still around. So joining together really helps to make our program strong. And then, we can't do any of it without the volunteers. So we have a training each spring, and where we teach our volunteers together, and we actually go to the river with our sampling gear and we learn how to do it. And we will put that training on the radio and in the paper. And, you want to do whatever works in your community to garner volunteers. You might want to put up flyers on, boards in your grocery store, whatever about works in your community to find volunteers. And we also, it's more fun to do it together. So our minimum teams are 2 people, but I think it's really more fun usually when there's 3 to 4 people in a team. So then we choose our waterways. We wanted to choose inputs into the Rio Grande that were in and around Taos. And, we listened to the community when we were first choosing sites, and then we also just kind of chose geographically. These made sense to us. So the Red River has the Molycorp mine in Cuesta, so a heavy metal mine. We sample above and below that on the Red River here. And then the Ski Valley is here. So we sample above and below the Ski Valley on the Rio Hondo, and then at the Rio Grande right here where the Hondo comes in. And then we sample below the Taos Pueblo. They have their own monitoring team and environment department that samples these rivers. But we do sample the river as it comes out of the Pueblo and as it goes by a car wash and it goes through a community here. Then we sample the Rio Fernando, which we saw some maps of as it comes through Taos Canyon and through town. And then we also usually sample in Pilar, south of Taos on the Rio Grande, but we don't always have enough community engagement and volunteers. So our data here is a little more spotty than the other rivers. We sample each river in 4 to 5 places, and we do each one 3 times a year. So this just shows all those spots I mentioned, but those are the actual locations of our samples. And we do each one of those 3 times a year. And then on the days, so each day we'll do 3 days, and each day all those sites get sampled. And if we've had public concerns, I'm seeing bubbles, I'm seeing algae, I'm concerned about my neighbor's septic, we'll try to go to those spots on the same day if we can as our volunteer days, so that we can, send the samples all to the lab at the same time, and they can and often if it does turn out to be a spot of concern, it'll become a new site, or at least a site that we sample once a year, maybe not 3 times. So now that we know where to sample, we have our volunteers, what do we want to sample? And this is where we'll talk a little bit more about water quality standards and impairments. What we sample is variable by river, based on what's going on with that river and based on what we know about the past of the river and what we've found. Maybe we've been finding a nutrient problem on the Rio Pueblo, so we keep sampling that. Or we've been finding an aluminum impairment from the Molycorp mines. We sample aluminum every year on the Red River. But to start, you'll want to know, if you're starting a new group, you'll want to know what that river is impaired for. And so you'll look for an impaired list. It tells you, what parts of each stream isn't meeting a water quality standard. So so we want to understand briefly what is a water quality standard that I keep talking about. They have 3 parts. They have designated uses. So that's what's the river being used for. And And then they have the water quality standard, the criteria. So what can the temperature be? How high can it go? What can the pH be? How much aluminum is allowed in that river? There are standards for all of these things. And then the third part of water quality standards is the anti-degradation policy. And actually the major tool for that part of water quality standards is that outstanding natural resource waters that we learned about. So that's the main tool to not degrade our waters further than they already are. So this gives a big hint, but who can tell me what they think are some designated uses for our waters? What are things we use our waters for that the state or federal government might say called designated uses? Recreation, right? Were you thinking swimming is one of those? Okay. I think there's swimming, and I think there's also a recreation use that's more like boating. Any other ideas for what uses they might break down? Right. Drinking water is a use. Exactly. Any other? Exactly. Fishing is a use, and that's actually considered a secondary use. So they're considering that if you're fishing, you're probably walking in the water with gear on, but you might get splashed by the water or touch it with your hands. But it's not as strongly protected. The water that's only used for fishing isn't as strongly protected as water that's considered used for swimming. And then water that's used for drinking is protected even further. So higher water quality standards. You're gonna have your highest standards for things like drinking, a little bit lower for swimming, lower if it's just fishing, even lower if it's just something like recreation and boating, where they don't really expect you to actually get in the water. Yes. Right, irrigation is a use. Wildlife drinking is a use. So that's a pretty low one that we put, but yes, irrigation is a large one. So those are pretty much the major uses. There's a few others that I'm not thinking of, but those are the major ones. And so they're all going to have different standards based on those uses. So one thing I wanted to say before we move on there is that, so if you know of a river that, one reason to understand these impaired lists is that they're going to tell you the designated uses. And if you look at the stream section you're familiar with, it might say the designated uses, the highest one is fishing. And you might say, well, I've been swimming in that river my whole life, or my neighbors swim in that river. And you can actually tell your environment department that, and you can petition to get stronger standards for that river. You can say, I have proof that people swim in this river and it should be protected higher. So that's one reason to understand what's going on there. So this just shows some impairments on the upper Rio Grande. So talking about that upper section in northern New Mexico, the issues that show up are temperature, the water's too hot. Turbidity is a measure of the clarity of the water, but it really tells you that there's too many salts and too many sediments in the water. E. coli bacteria is an issue in the water. And then dissolved oxygen is another big one. So the oxygen that fish and macroinvertebrates need to live is not high enough in the water. You want more dissolved oxygen in the water. This is what the state and EPA have found as some of the impairments, some of the issues on the upper Rio Grande. We've got loss of riparian habitat is a big one. So not enough trees along the river, which is causing that temperature impairment. We've got highway and bridge runoff is a large one, grazing in the riparian zone, and rangeland grazing all show up as big ones, as well as water diversion. And I don't know a lot about what other recreation means, but that looks like it's causing a big problem. So if you're interested in learning about what's going on near you and your designated uses and impairments, this is that link. The TCEQ has a webpage for surface water quality standards, and that's where you'll find everything that you need to know about this. Okay, so now that we understand why how we learn what we want to sample. The parameters that the Rios to Taos water sentinels use, we've chosen temperature and pH. We look at electrical conductivity, which is a measure of the salts in the water and sediment. We also look at dissolved oxygen. We look at aluminum in the Red River because the Molycorp molybdenum mine, when rain hits the waste rock from the mine, it creates aluminum into the river. We look at nutrients, those phosphates and nitrates, especially in the Rio Pueblo. And then we also often sample for ammonia coming out of the wastewater treatment plants to make sure that they're cleaning that up as they should. And so we'll look at that usually at least once a year at the beginning in the Rio Pueblo and the Rio Hondo, where the Taos Ski Valley wastewater treatment plant is. And then if we're not seeing an ammonia issue, we don't keep sampling that one 3 times. Okay, so that sort of summarizes what we do and how you would start a citizen science water quality team. Any thoughts or questions? We pause here. Our next part will be diving into the results we found over 15 years. Yes.
Just on surface. You're only focused on surface water.
Yes, we focus on surface water. We will sample drinking water for citizens if they reach out and say, I'm concerned about E. coli in my well. I just moved in and I just want to check out the well. We'll do a grab sample of the well for them. But this program is focused on surface water.
This Sierra Club program.
Yes, the Sierra Club program. Yes.
Because groundwater is the issue. We don't have any surface water here. And when we do, it's only for a couple of months a year.
Right.
Groundwater is an issue. Groundwater in New Mexico and in this part of Texas that, is under agricultural fields.
Right.
And fertilizer and everything, pesticides that seep down in it. And over in Otero Mesa, there's these salt basin aquifer. I don't know, what is that? 55 million acre feet? They're not sure. But now there's a dozen or so oil wells that are being drilled into it. And that's an enormous supply of brackish fresh water, brackish water. But I mean, in the desert, any water is better than no water.
Right.
So to me, if this program would have relevance here, it's going to be in groundwater because that's what's threatened.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And I think you could do the same thing, just focusing on groundwater. You could reach out to landowners who would be willing to let you sample from their well. It could be the volunteers themselves who are like, oh, I live here, let's sample my well every year. Or they could be 2 different things. You could have volunteers that go to people's houses and sample from the wells. Maybe there's a way to sample the water being put on the fields if you had willing agricultural folks who I don't know how, if they spray them right out of the large equipment and you could collect some or how it pumps. Yeah.
Pipes.
Yeah. So
flushing
maybe
it into acequias and canals.
Okay. So yeah, maybe there could be some sort of like a acequia collection program when that water is going to be going in to those. And I think it could really function the same way. It would just be more about choosing those locations and getting landowner permission, I think. In this example, but I don't see why the same idea couldn't work, and you would still be sampling for similar things.
Right. In New Mexico, of course, the groundwater is public property. So there probably wouldn't be a lot of objection to sampling. In Texas, it's private property.
Right. It might have to be homeowners near the agricultural fields that are going to be willing to let you check their wells, or what'd you say?
For friendly owners.
Right, friendly owners. Yeah. But I think, I think you can usually find them. It might be slow to start, but then once you find a few people, they talk to their neighbors and say, no one's suing us over this. They just want to collect data, you can usually, gain people's trust slowly that way when you're not, I'm not pointing a finger at you, because we run into that with the E. coli sampling on the Rio Fernando, because there's a big issue with people's septic tanks that are causing this E. coli, but we're not finger pointing. We're not, suing, we're not causing people trouble, we're just collecting data, and then we're bringing in money to restore the river to help them upgrade their septic tanks, you know. So usually it goes pretty well. I know that it's different down here with things like that, but I do think you can gain people's trust and you can do it in a way that's helpful to the environment but doesn't hurt people's pocketbooks. Any other thoughts there? Thank you for bringing that up. It's a great point. Okay, so a little bit about our results and what we found in the Upper Rio Grande. What's the water quality that's coming down? Whether it is reaching down here in surface water, it sounds like a lot doesn't get down here, but you know, the surface water and groundwater are connected. So, you know, what's going on with our surface water up there is still seeping into the groundwater, which is still seeping slowly downstream. So, you know, it's all connected. So we put our results into a report that we send to our environment department. You can look at these reports on our website. And then I put this here because I knew I'd forget to mention the triennial review. I think Texas has to have that too. I think all states do. They have to review that water quality standards document we talked about. They have to look at that every 3 years. And industry, so mines and other industry farmers will go to those hearings and they'll say, we want the regulations decreased downstream of where I am. You know, so the Molycorp mine every 3 years goes to ours and says, we want the water quality regulations for aluminum increased so that we can put more aluminum into the river. And Amigos Bravos goes to the hearings and says, no, like we have all these data that show aluminum's just increasing in the river. If you increase the standard, we're just going to have more and more and more, and you know, fish will die. And we have experts come in and talk about it. So that's happening in your state too. And you can be an advocate and you can go to those hearings and you can keep your ear to the ground and learn what industry is going to the hearings. You can figure out what environmental group. It might be Sierra Club around here. I'm not sure. Sometimes they get involved. But there'll be some environmental group you can support that'll be going to those hearings too and fighting for keeping the standards strong. So we use our results for that as well. And this is just that federal regulation that requires states to have that triennial review. It really ends up being more like every 5 years. By the time they start the review, write the documents, have the hearing, and then start the next review, it's about 5 years.
Is this a state or a federal requirement?
This is a federal requirement in the Clean Water Act. Okay, so we sampled E. coli since 2007. I don't have the last few years on these graphs, but I'll mention what I know about since 2019 when I can. But you can see here that so the standard for E. coli is 235 coliform-forming units. That's right here, this red line. And most of our rivers, the Rio Hondo is not having an E. coli issue. The Red River is nice and low. But then our Rio Pueblo and our Rio Fernando do have exceedances here and there. And the Rio Fernando has continued to have issues since 2019. And do you remember, these are averages of, so each point, so 2011, there was 3 points taken on the Rio Fernando 3 times a year at 4 or 5 sites. So this is an average of those 4 or 5 sites on the Rio Fernando 3 times a year. So when you break this down, I don't think I included it, but the E. coli graph for the Rio Fernando only, there's a lot more exceedances. You know, it's above this red line a lot more often than this shows, but just those averages tell you that, you know, we have an issue there, and the Rio Pueblo does as well, but not as frequently. So dissolved, oh yes. Yes, absolutely. They need to.
If you can repeat.
Oh, the question was, do we see a big difference in the time of year that we sample? And that's a really good question. We do our sampling in the summer because for several reasons. One is that a big one is that, you know, a lot of these rivers are frozen in the winter up there. So, you know, there's all there, especially the Rio Hondo, there's a lot of ice and accessibility issues. There's 2 feet of snow up there. You know, you can't really get to can't send volunteers safely to the river in the winter, that time of year. But then there's some issues, you know, like the Rio Fernando really only flows in the spring well, and then we'll also often have dry spots in the summer where we can't always get the samples we want, or we have to slightly tweak the location. So I think that we would see variation in the winter. I think we would see less E. coli because it's colder. So E. coli is a bacteria that breeds in warm temperatures. And so I don't think we wouldn't see much of an issue with E. coli in the winter. Temperature that I'll show in a minute, you know, would be less of an issue because the water is going to be really cold. But that summer is when people are using the water, when they're swimming in it, when they're going to the parks. So we think it's the most important time to know what's going on because there's the most contact with the rivers then. So I think, you know, season wise, it would change based on where you're sampling. Down here, you might want to sample more like year round. Sometimes, yeah, the environment department tries to sample in the winter. So they usually have some data that can back us up, and the Forest Service tries to sample a bit more year round. So they have data that can back us up. But with volunteers, we just can't really safely send them out in the winter. So you know, so the data kind of, we work together with those other data collectors. BLM collects their own data at certain times, so we can usually kind of find data from, you know, that helps it to be more robust. Yes.
Do you use similar standards to the agencies that also make those kind of samplings for the testing and the lab experiments and things like that?
So do they all follow the same standards?
Like methodology on the sampling, on the testing?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So yeah, we do try to have similar samples. We try to use similar meters. The environment department has certain rules that the data they're going to accept. So the data like that they'll actually use and that would be really looked at as high quality, and it's something like a hearing. There's all these requirements of what we can use. We have to write something called the quality assurance plan, and we have to get all the equipment we use approved by them, and we have to use certain meters, and we have to collect for a certain amount of time, and the volunteers have to sign all these forms that say they've been trained. And yeah, so there's a lot of quality assurance that goes into it if you want it to be used in things like hearings and by environment departments. You know, if you want to use your data more for just, you know, gathering public like momentum, you know, I think that you could just collect it and use it for getting attention to a topic like, hey, this river needs your support, you know, we need this. Like there's times when you may not have to go through all the bureaucracy and rigmarole that we do. But if you want the data to be used for policy change, you often have to do that and make sure that you're in alignment with the other organizations and that you're having strong data quality. Another good question. Thank you. Yes.
Folks are interested in knowing more about water.
They can't hear online. You have to hold that mic.
Hold it. Okay. If folks are interested in knowing more about Texas water, it would be interesting to look at the Texas Water Development Board's website. We are divided into 16 districts in Texas, and each one is sort of semi-autonomous. We belong to the Far West Texas Water Planning Group here. And I'm not sure about the meeting schedule, but I know it's a big political football.
Great. Thanks for that information. Yeah. I just want to do a quick time check. How are we doing? Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm glad I asked. I can't see the time on the computer. Should I hard stop in 3 minutes?
Because people have to go, right? Your classes.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'm glad I checked. I'm glad we've had so many questions though. Thank you all for being so engaged. So I think, what do we want to make sure that we get to? I think, we've got a temperature issue on the Rio Pueblo. We've got electrical conductivity issue on the Rio Hondo. A lot of that is from all the development happening at the ski valley that I mentioned. There's a lot of sediment being pushed in the river, and there's a lot more people up there than there used to be. So we're keeping our eye on that and talking with the environment department and sending them pictures of what's happening up there often. And we've still got an aluminum issue on the Red River that's being put as impaired again based on our data. And we're working with the mine to help to make sure that they're doing their reclamation activities as they should. And over the years, we should start seeing less aluminum in the river as they finish restoring that waste rock and planting on it and doing the activities they're required to do for cleanup. Okay, I'm gonna just go through, I'm just gonna skip some of these. Basically, the main stem of the Rio Grande is looking pretty good. When we sample the main stem, we don't see a lot of issues. There was one low year with low dissolved oxygen. The water was really low that year and it was really hot. But in general, it's doing well with pH and other things that we check it for. We also have a new exciting program where we're checking the wastewater treatment plants for things called PFAS and pharmaceuticals. Has anyone heard of PFAS? They are scary. They are a forever chemical. They're something that has been around a long time, but we call them an emerging pollutant because we're just realizing how bad it is. They're not going away. They're calling it the forever chemical, and they're in a lot of things that we use. They're in any soft plastic that you touch, any candy wrappers, any popcorn bags, any soft plastic, the things that toilet paper, is wrapped in, that soft stuff. So we're sampling our treatment plants for that and also for pharmaceuticals, and we're finding high levels of things, but we still have to analyze these data. But we're excited to move forward with this and to see what sort of changes we can enact around that. There are drinking water standards just released last week for this chemical, but there's no surface water regulations yet. So in conclusion, I think I sort of said this, when I went through the graph. So I'm going to skip to our questions left unanswered. What are the aluminum levels in the main stem of the Rio Grande? We're going to work with our citizen scientists to sample that more often. And we're going to think about how can we reduce these PFAS and pharmaceuticals coming out of our wastewater treatment plants. So what can the plants do to filter those out? And what can you do? You can do things like buy phosphate-free detergents. You can plant native plants, especially if you have a river or if you just, in your garden. Native plants are going to help have healthy soil and help the water that runs off your land be healthy. You can join volunteer restoration and cleanup groups. Don't use pesticides. And avoid chemical products, plastics, and Teflon as much as possible. Don't buy those products whenever possible. This is based in Albuquerque, but I thought you all might be interested in the Albuquerque Wildlife Federation. They have these weekend camp trips where you go restore wetlands with like-minded folks, and it's really fun. We have one up in Midnight Meadows in that Cuesta wetland I showed you, but they have projects down this way, a few in southern New Mexico that wouldn't be too far of a drive, and they're a really fun group to get involved in. So I really recommend checking them out. And if you're interested in starting your own group, please reach out to me. If you're interested in joining the Sierra Club, Lawrence is here with the speaker. He just gave a question a minute ago. You can subscribe for free to your local Sierra Club blog. You can join the Sierra Club. And you can also sign up for our emails for free at Amigos Bravos. All right. Thank you very much for hanging in with me on a Friday.